Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've been looking at the reign of Charles I through the lens of his actions. The goal is to understand the Puritan colonies a little better when we travel back across the Atlantic. We left off last week in the summer of 1640. The short parliament had come and gone. The Scots had embarrassed the English, and the long parliament was coming fast. We had a pretty full plate last week. We looked at the opening salvos with Scotland, the ramifications of calling a parliament after 11 years. And those actions led us to this week's conversation, the destruction of the Earl of Strafford, previously Thomas Wentworth, and the Irish uprising and how it helped the opposition galvanize London. Now, next week, finally, we'll watch the chess game between Charles and John Pym that changed the course of English politics. So let's get to it. There was a lot of civil unrest across the country in 1640. Everything was starting to add up. In January, Thomas Wentworth, now promoted to the Earl of Strafford, was called upon to end the Scottish uprising. After all, he had tamed Ireland. That was a bad call on Charles's part. But by summer, Strafford was commander-in-chief against the Scots. The army was not happy, and it behaved poorly. They harassed the villages as they traveled through, and in turn, many of the communities banded together and ran them out of town. The soldiers blamed the officers, especially if he was a suspected Catholic or Irishman. It was not a pretty situation. It was actually quite ugly. These assaults were not minor either. One poor fellow, a lieutenant, thought to be a Catholic, was dismembered and robbed. The churches were vandalized, the clergy assaulted. The army appeared to be like-minded with the Covenanters they were supposed to be stopping. Common lands were now off limits to the general public, even for hunting. In turn, the general public managed to convince local law enforcement that the royal national government was out of control. So there seems to be like a total breakdown of civility within different groups around the country. And this was the same time frame that Leslie had his victory at Tyne. It was this victory that provoked the John Pym co-authored Petition of 12 Peers demanding a new parliament. So let's set the stage a bit. The Scots wanted money to leave the country. Charles had no authority or ability to pay them. Only Parliament could have done that. Strafford, now in charge of the army, thought that he could hold Yorkshire, but nowhere else. The Scots were open to peace, but they wanted £40,000 a month to support their troops in England until their demands for peace were met. In the end, they agreed to £850 a day. Even the city of London, now clearly tired of Charles, pitched in £50,000 toward the cost, with the understanding that a parliament would be called. So the two armies faced off at the king's expense, an expense that could really only be paid by Parliament. So the Bishops' War was over, kind of, with the Scots remaining as an occupying force in the northern part of the country. Great situation, right? It was bad for Charles. At least half of the lords from the short parliament of the previous spring were still in London, and they threatened to call a parliament without the king if he didn't issue the writ himself. So like other times in this podcast, we're going to move in and out of the chronological order a bit, but I think you'll see the rationale as we develop a few things at once. Well, a few things that happened around the same time. So the country was set ablaze, again, with the second calling of a parliament in a year. Not much had changed. 3/5 of the previous parliament's members returned. The newcomers were parliamentarians. They were the opposition, and they were very organized. All of the previous parliamentarians had also been returned to Parliament. So this new Parliament, the Long Parliament, met on November 3rd, and they assembled 40 committees to investigate all sorts of things. Ship money, the courts, the church, all of Charles's tools and people since the last full Parliament from way back in 1629. The angle Parliament and John Pym took was a cautious one. They did not attack Charles directly. Frankly, Simon Schama pointed out that if Charles would have played it smart, If he could have seen the opportunity here, he could have humbled himself a bit, but retained power. The focus on his advisors was a way out for him directly to pay any real consequence, but he could never have allowed himself to be neutered that way, not voluntarily. The two specific people they focused on were Thomas Wentworth, again now the Earl of Strafford, and Bishop Laud, two of Charles's top advisors. At this point, all of Parliament was on the same page, more or less. I mean, they wanted to clean house. And for what it's worth, Strafford claimed to have evidence that proved that John Pym and others had been in contact with the Scots as the army marched through England. They had been in friendly contact. And that could have ended badly for John Pym, but Strafford waited too long and Pym struck first. It was November 11th when St. Stephen's Chapel's doors were locked and the keys were removed from the door, and the articles of impeachment for Strafford were drawn up. And later that day, they were taken to the House of Lords. Now, picture this scene. They weren't just taken to the House of Lords like some messenger took them, courier. In the group, there was John Pym and John Hampden, you remember him, and 300 other members of the House of Commons. I mean, that must have been an intimidating sight. 302 guys, walking these impeachment papers over to the House of Lords. I imagine the noise alone as they walked. The crowds that must have seen that. People knew what was going on. They knew something was going on. And Strafford by this time was in London. Charles had summoned him back, and he had arrived to a friendly audience. But by that afternoon, things had cooled, and he was in trouble. He was quickly taken into custody and imprisoned in the Tower, and he was abused by the crowds along the way. So this, again, was turning very ugly. Next came Bishop Laud, then others of the king's ministers. Some even fled the country. I mean, think about this. It was chaos. It was a coup, the dismantling of the king's court in many ways. Must have been scary times, confusing times. And Charles was in Scotland. And this would be just the beginning. Guys like John Pym and Arthur Haselrig and Brooke and Say and Seal, they wanted more. They wanted the old institutions eradicated. The episcopacy had to go. They kind of liked the Scottish setup. And if they had their way, they would be running the show. While the Scots had been paid, the English army had not been paid. And rumor was they would mutiny. The people were rightfully scared. Think about what's going on here. Not just in London, not just within, Parliament, but within the countryside. You've got an occupying army, and then your own national army is actually terrorizing you more than the occupiers. Anyways, the Scots wanted to usher in Presbyterianism, and the House of Commons received a petition of 15,000 signatures demanding the dissolution of the episcopacy. So this is turning ugly fast. It's turning uglier faster, picking up momentum. Pym played on all of these fears, all of these problems. He exploited all sides to his and Parliament's advantage. Charles wasn't stupid. He saw the threat for what it was. One counter to this was to possibly offer John Pym a spot on the Privy Council, being a close advisor to the king. I mean, it sounds crazy, but why not? It had worked many times before, including Thomas Wentworth 11 years earlier. But of course, Pym was a little more loyal to his convictions than all of these other turncoats. What was coming was the destruction of the absolute monarchy in England. Of course, all of this was just theoretical. It's unofficial until later in the month of November when Charles was confronted with the Grand Remonstrance. But meantime, the Scottish delegation that was present for terms of peace was getting along quite well with Parliament. Well, at least with the House of Commons. The Lords were a little more hostile. The Lords would prove to be, just like in Scotland, the king's asset, loyal. Anyway, the Scots wanted Strafford to pay a price for suggesting an Irish Catholic army to fight the Scots. They blamed Laud and the Common Book of Prayer, as well as Strafford, for all of the problems everybody was experiencing right now. They said their aims were Romanish, and that's a nasty charge in this environment. And by the way, the Irish were in full rebellion mode at this very time, terrorizing their Protestant, English, and Scottish neighbors. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So Strafford now had powerful enemies in Ireland, England, and Scotland. I mean, he's pretty much screwed at this point. He's pretty much out of allies. But he wasn't going to go down easy. And he was as equipped as John Pym for the fight. And eventually, the charge would be treason. And although he was not a popular man, he was not a traitor to the king. I mean, that would be his measuring rod, right? Fidelity to Charles, not Parliament. And again, he'd been arrested and placed in the Tower, but for what? That was his question. What did I do? So there was a trial, and that lasted 7 weeks. It ran from March through April in 1641. And for what it's worth, Strafford defended himself well. It was true that he had offended a lot of people, but he had not committed treason. He did not deny that he had confiscated Irish land or expanded plantations against the English will, or that he had supported Laudianism. It was all for the king. In total, there were 28 charges brought against him. 27 of those charges would ultimately be dropped, but one would damn him. And that was really questionable. And it was number 23, if you're wondering. But let's work through this. When talking about the Scottish invasion earlier in the year, you recall, he had offered to bring his Irish army, his Irish Catholic army, to England to fight the Scots. Remember, I told you to put that in that filing chest right towards the front of your brain. Don't forget that point. But that was the focus of the conversation that he had, to drive the Scots out of England and ultimately defeat them. So you had an invading army in Protestant England at a time when Charles was not popular and was suspect of Roman sympathies. Anyway, Strafford has said in regards to the Scots on May 5th of that previous year, in a letter to the King's Council, quote, "Everything is to be done as power will admit, and that you are to do. They refused. You are acquitted toward God and man. You have an army in Ireland you may employ here to reduce this kingdom. Confident as anything under heaven, Scotland shall not hold out 5 months." End quote. Presumably, he's talking about the Scottish kingdom would be reduced. I mean, you can clearly see that from the quote. But there was a transcript of that offer presented by Henry Vane. You remember our old friend from Massachusetts Bay, the governor who sided with Anne Hutchinson during the Antinomian controversy. Remember, John Winthrop and company basically ran him out of the colony. Well, here he was, several years later, part of the Puritan Parliament. Just like today's politicians, they seem to just get recycled. Anyway, nobody knew if the charge would stick, but the angle was that Strafford was talking about using the Irish against the English army. I mean, after all, Strafford was a king's man, wasn't he? Now, the funny thing is that nobody that had been there on May 5th remembered anything being said about using the Irish army against England, specifically. But what would or could it be used for after the Scots were dealt with was the current question. I mean, and that's really cheap and weak, but it worked. Just like we see today, politicians making weak charges against their opposition, and instead of being excoriated for the insult to everybody's intelligence, not to mention demonstrating either poor contextual skills or stupidity, the argument sticks, and a man's life is ruined over technicality. It's shameful, really. So Strafford didn't take this lying down. He had some great replies. His general question was this, quote, "What will be the end if words which are spoken in the King's Privy Council, half understood or misunderstood by its members, are to be turned into crime? No one will any longer have the courage to speak out his opinion plainly to the king." End quote. The lawyers also declared themselves on his side. I mean, he made a great argument, right? And there was no doubt that he had won his case. But that didn't matter. So of this, Winston Churchill wrote, quote, "The Commons, baffled, claimed to advance new evidence. Strafford demanded that if this were admitted, he should have an equal right. The Lords decided in his favor. And then suddenly there arose from the mass of members gathered in the court loud cries of 'Withdraw! Withdraw!' The Commons trooped back to St. Stephen's Chapel and again locked their doors. Was this enemy of English rights to escape by legal processes? They knew he was their foe, and they meant to have his blood. They would dispense with a trial and have him declared guilty by Act of Parliament. Pym and Hampden did not themselves put forward the plan of a Bill of Attainder. They had it moved by one of their principal followers, but when it was launched, they threw their weight behind it, and the weight of the angry, tumultuous city outside. The Lords affected to ignore what was known to be going forward in the lower house, and listened with evident sympathy to Strafford's closing speech. So the bottom line is the House of Commons realizes that Strafford really hasn't committed treason, and they probably overplayed their hand. And since he was game for a legal battle, they weren't going to win, right? They weren't going to have the numbers in the end. So they go back to St. Stephen's Chapel to scheme. And while they're there, Strafford addresses the House of Lords. And this is what he said. It's pretty powerful. He says, quote, "My lords, it is my present misfortune, but forever yours. And accept your lordship's wisdom, provide for it. The shedding of my blood may make a way for the tracing of yours. You, your estates, your posterities, lie all at the stake if such learned gentlemen as these, whose lungs are well acquainted with such proceedings, shall be started out against you. If your friends, your counsel, were denied access to you, if your professed enemies admitted to witness against you, if every word, intention, and circumstance of yours be alleged as treasonable, not because of a statute, but a consequence, a construction heaved upon in a high rhetorical strain, I leave it to your lordship's consideration to foresee what may be the issue of so dangerous, so recent precedencies." So we're not done yet, but the reality is, or the point is that what Strafford is saying is, you guys see the bizarre nature of what is going on. You have the power to stop this. And if you don't stop this, beware, because it may visit you as well, right? It's not that somebody has to do anything wrong. It's that enough people have enough power, they can do to them as they will regardless. So he goes on, quote, "These gentlemen tell me they speak in defense of the common weal against my arbitrary laws. Give me leave to say it. I speak in defense of the commonweal against their arbitrary treason. For if this latitude be admitted, what prejudice shall follow to the king, to the country, if you and your posterity be disabled by the same from the greatest affairs of the kingdom? For my poor self, if it were not for your lordship's interest, and the interest of a saint in heaven, his first wife, who hath left me 2 pledges here on earth," at these words he was overcome with emotion, "were it not for this, I should never take the pains to keep up this ruinous cottage of mine. Nor could I leave it in better time than this, when I hope the better part of the world think that by this misfortune I had given testimony of my integrity to God, my king, and country." End quote. That's powerful in a lot of ways. He had correctly and quite succinctly articulated exactly what had happened, and everybody knew it. And the reality is, sadly, not enough people cared. All of Westminster was a party. There were crowds, there was singing, sermons were being preached. They wanted Strafford's head. They harassed the lords in the streets. They were the faction of Parliament that was loyal to Charles and willing to at least listen to Strafford. The crowd yelled, "Justice, justice," as they walked the streets. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but think about the menacing nature of that action, of what was actually going on, the pressure that's being exerted from all sides. And at the end of the day, frankly, for what he's being charged for, an innocent man's life hangs in the balance. On top of everything else that was going on in the country, the Scots are, sitting in the northern part of the country, your army's falling apart, the government has cut people off from common lands. I mean, this is a mess. With this environment, the Puritan MPs smelled blood in the water. They knew what could be realized here. They had the opportunity to destroy their enemy. The problem was there was some doubt about his guilt. I mean, you couldn't have that. Well, you could not convict with that hanging over the trial, not in normal proceedings. So again, they switched strategies. They changed the impeachment process to what is called an act of attainder. Because with an act of attainder, that would be guilty by Parliament. For guilt, you needed proof, but you didn't need proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's kind of like being on trial and found guilty without details. Totally unfair, whether you side with the king or Parliament at this point. I mean, and the thing is that Strafford had a good argument here. I mean, it's just like we could look at things going on in our society today or any given time in history. You love it when your enemy is being defeated, the person that you think is, your great foe. But if you're going to use kind of dastardly tactics, don't be surprised when it happens to you next. You have to be very careful with what you do. I mean, what exactly is the art and the strategy and the rules of war, right? So anyways, he was on trial to be impeached, but then it becomes a trial for capital punishment. And it passed the House of Commons on April 21st, 1641, 204 to 59. So it's a blowout. Now, it seems like to me, as I'm watching, from my position hundreds of years removed. And frankly, I probably would have tended to be philosophically more on the side of the House of Commons and Parliament. But it does seem like, in all fairness, that this whole business was starting to smell like high heaven. So some of the dissenters, some of the 59, had actually started the process against the king. And they started smelling this too, right? I think they realized that it had all gone too far. For their act of reason, they were now looked at with suspicion as well. I mean, that was dirty politics, and it was effective. You know, the lower chamber had London and most of the MPs on its side. But listen to how crazy this got. Winston Churchill wrote this, quote, "When Oliver St. John urged the case for the attainder in a great conference between the houses, he used arguments not of law, but of revolution. Parliament was not bound, like inferior tribunals, by existing laws, but was justified in making new ones to suit circumstances. Its only guide should be care for the public weal. It was the political body, embracing all, from the king to the beggar, and could deal with individuals for the good of the whole, could open a vein to let out the corrupted blood. It had been said that the law must precede the offense, that where no law was, there could be no transgression. But that plea could not avail for the man who had desired to overthrow all laws. It was never accounted either cruelty or foul play, said St. John, to knock foxes and wolves on the head because they be beasts of prey. The warrener sets traps for polecats and other vermin for the preserving of the warren." End quote. So first of all, he's using a very biblical argument out of context, but theologically from the book of Romans, when he says, where there is no law, there can be no offense. Clearly, the people of Parliament understood the argument that he was making. He's appealing to their sense of theology. Ill-gotten, I would say. But did you hear what he said? I mean, I think about this in terms of the current situation we have in politics in the United States of America and how dirty and divisive it is. That we're starting to see some of these same tactics. And my fear is that they'll become more and more common. They won't be appalling for very long. But he basically said, look, the guy's a scoundrel. We don't really need to rely on what the law says. Let's write new laws and make him guilty from those. That should have scared everybody. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. Even guys that agreed with him, that should have caused people to back off. This is where, to me, it's like this has become this rowdy, chaotic crowd of like marauders almost, because they're not thinking straight on this. They're not thinking about tradition and the rule of law and organized, civilized society. Well, the act of attainder required the king's signature. So what do you think happened? You are correct. Charles had no intention of signing it. So Charles's stand on principle was supposed to save Strafford. Even though this situation represented the best hope for Charles to start over, fresh, Charles knew Strafford was just a scapegoat. Frankly, he was probably right. I mean, even if he signed, it's not like this parliament was going to stop there, right? And if you can't beat him, you join him. Or at least you ask them to join you. So like we said, one of the ways that Charles was hoping to wiggle out of this whole messy battle was to offer John Pym a position on the Privy Council. He was also going to send his own troops to the Tower to free Strafford. For all of his missteps over the years, Strafford stepped up on this one big time. If it wasn't right, at least it was noble. He demonstrated a fidelity to Charles that I find personally admirable. It's not common for a man to sacrifice himself for another man these days. Not in politics, not genuinely. I mean, politics is truly a blood sport and is not for the faint of heart. Anyway, the Earl of Strafford saw what was coming and he knew it would only provoke more trouble. So on May 4th, 1641, 3 days after Charles said that he would not sign the Act of Attainder, Strafford wrote to Charles and told him to sign. He said this, quote, "May it please your sacred majesty, I understand the minds of men are more and more incensed against me. Notwithstanding your majesty hath declared that in your princely opinion I am not guilty of treason, and that you are not satisfied in your conscience to pass the bill. This bringeth me in a very great strait. There is before me the ruin of my children and family, hitherto untouched, with any foul crime. Here before me are the many ills, which may befall your sacred person and the whole kingdom. should yourself and Parliament part less satisfied one with the other than is necessary for the preservation both of king and people. Here are before me the things most valued, most feared by mortal men, life and death. To say, sir, that there hath not been strife in me, were to make me less man, then, God knoweth, my infirmities make me. And to call a destruction upon myself and my young children will find no easy consent from flesh and blood. So now, to set your majesty's conscience at liberty, I do most humbly beseech your majesty for prevention of evils, which may happen by your refusal to pass this bill. End quote. There's a measure of bravery and integrity there that I think few men actually ever ascribe to. I don't know what I would do in that situation. But Strafford looked across the political landscape and what was going on in England at the time and said, you know what? Everything is going to be ruined. So instead of sacrificing the many, why not sacrifice the one? And I'm the one. Sign the bill. But this did prove to be mistake number one in this quick repetition of multiple mistakes on the part of Charles. So the first mistake was that he signed the Bill of Attainder on May 10th. And then mistake number two was when Charles tried to storm the Tower and rescue Strafford. But the governor, Sir William Balfour, closed the gates. Now remember, the Tower of London was a fortress. I mean, it's not just a fortress. It's one that's capable of leveling half of London from behind its own walls through cannon fire. It's a virtually unassailable tower in London. Balfour even turned down a bribe for Strafford's release. All of London wanted his head. And again, picture this scene in your head, the intensity that's going on here, the division within the government and the public, the marching of the king's troops to the Tower, the refusal to let them in. There was nothing they could do about it. The public spectacle, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the bitterness that would have caused. And I'm assuming that the general public is ridiculing them at this point. I didn't read that anywhere, but it seems to me that they would have known what was going on. They'd have been ridiculing the troops. And then to make matters worse, rumor was that the Queen was next. Now, mistake number three was when Charles signed another bill, the Triennial Bill, and that ended the ship money. It ended the granted tonnage and poundage year by year. It required a parliament at least every 3 years. And lastly, most notably, prevented him or anyone from dissolving a parliament against their consent. Charles was neutered. He then wrote the Lords on Strafford's behalf requesting leniency, life in prison and not death. That was May 10th. On May 12th, the Earl of Strafford was executed. Archbishop Laud, from his own place in the Tower, watched the execution from a distance. And one day he'd suffer the same fate. And I wonder if he knew that as he watched. I wonder if he was getting a sense of what he was up against. William Laud blamed Charles for Strafford's death, but he was in good company. King Charles himself did as well for the rest of his life. Although Parliament failed to abolish the episcopacy at this point, it was blocked by the Lords. Many things were accomplished, like the abolition of ship money. The Scots didn't like that the episcopacy had survived. They did not like the fact that the bishops had survived. Some Englishmen even liked them. I mean, they didn't want to destroy the church artifacts and the buildings. The Scots weren't happy about that either. I mean, they did have English company, like Lord Brooke. He said that he hoped to see St. Paul's leveled. He wanted to see no one stone upon another of that building. And still, other factions wanted the monarch, Parliament, and the episcopacy to survive intact. They wanted a constitutional monarch. Charles wanted autocracy, and so did his closest advisor now, Henrietta Maria. The sides were pretty dug in. Nothing had changed. If anything, things had gotten worse. So with the Earl of Strafford out of the way, and things not yet settled with the Scots, Charles went to Scotland in the summer of 1641 for negotiations. As usual, nothing is as easy as it seems with Charles, because he's actually hoping not just to make peace with the Scots, but he was trying to enlist the Scots for himself to use in England. And then Ireland rebelled. They had had a belly full of English rule. Strafford's gone, right? So now they feel like they're probably loosed from their yoke. So anyways, they had had a belly full of English rule, and they had had a belly full of Strafford. They had had a belly full of Protestant English transplants. They'd had a belly full of Presbyterian Scots. They'd had a belly full of confiscated land. And they took vengeance. The loyalty that Strafford spoke of was more like obedience or forced cooperation than loyalty. With all the turmoil, the Irish were weary of what would come next. There was even division among the Catholics. The Irish were nationalistic, and the English transplants, they were loyal to the king. So realizing that there was trouble everywhere for Charles, and realizing that all of the other groups giving Charles trouble were Protestant, they, the Irish, rebelled against Protestants, and they considered themselves doing the king's work. Such an odd time. Scary, confusing. I mean, it would have been hard to identify who your friends really were. I mean, we think we're divided today. It had to suck. Town by town or local population by local population, one would have to identify with who they were friends with and who they weren't, or they would have to face public aggression and assault and violence. There's nothing rational about that. This is a complete breakdown of civility. And meanwhile, back in England, as the reports came in, the people worried that this was all a plot backed by Charles of Irish Catholic aggression toward England ultimately. All while Charles is in Scotland. I mean, are you seeing how crazy this is? Can you even, keep track of this in your head? There's a lot of stuff going on. He's in Scotland. He's up to no good. He's actually rooting against England at this point. So I guess the English Parliament, they had the right idea of a plot. They just had the wrong potential co-conspirators with Charles at this point. And this is when the reports began to come in of the horrific brutality that Protestants were experiencing in Ireland, reminiscent of the days of Henry VIII and the Reformation across Europe, especially Spain and France and the Netherlands. Imagine the psyche of these people, what they had recently been through as a society, what was still going on the continent. I mean, we don't know war like that. We don't know that fear. We've had a few tastes of it nationally, maybe, but few of us have lived with that kind of fear constantly. It's not even a reasonable consideration in America. It's easy to see how national paranoia or fear can set in. Distrust from all sides, toward all sides. In Ireland, it was being reported and then immortalized on placards and engravings of babies being impaled, pregnant women with their babies being cut out of their bellies. The men were being slaughtered. Women and children were being snatched up, never to be heard from again. Throughout the uprising, people were stripped and forced into the wilderness naked, presumably to die. Houses were burned, livestock was confiscated or killed, regular folks just exploding on their neighbors, to the tune of about 4,000 people in the end. Perhaps the worst single event took place in Portadown. It was winter, 1641, and it was freezing. A record-setting cold winter. About 100 Protestant men, women and children, mostly women and children, had been stripped naked and taken to a barn where they were held overnight. Now imagine that scene. It's one of the coldest winters on record. And they're standing in this barn, about 100 people, men, women, and children, stripped naked. Imagine the noises in the barn or the smells. Not just the smells of maybe animals that had been there previously or still there, but smells of human waste as the 100 people just are forced to go to the bathroom in there. And the cold. And how would they have stayed warm but huddling together? I mean, picture that image in your head. There's a cruelty there, an inhumanity there. All presumably in the dark. Hungry. I'm not assuming they fed them or gave them water, right? The children crying and screaming, the women crying, maybe the men were crying, I don't know. How would you console one another? What if you lost your family members or your friends within that crowd? I mean, how loud was it? Were they praying? Maybe they were singing. I don't know. But anyway, in the morning, they were taken to the top of the bridge, where they were thrown over into the Bon River and drowned in the icy waters. And those who managed to escape the water were killed on shore. Imagine the scene, the public spectacle of it. These people have been huddled in a barn all night, freezing cold weather. They're huddled in a barn naked. And then they're taken to this bridge publicly as this large group and thrown off into the icy waters. There's something really kind of just, alarming about that. And again, this is just a complete, utter collapse of society. These people that had been rounded up, they were rounded up by their friends and neighbors. Who knows if they had done business the day before? Who knows if they had business planned for the next day? Did they work together? Did they go to the same schools? Did they hunt together? Sadly, based on human nature, I don't think this is totally unpredictable or uncommon in the human experience to have one people group that's been exploited by another or feels exploited by another. I don't know that these particular people they rounded up had exploited them, but they felt exploited for a long time and defenseless. and they finally take the bull by the horns. So it is kind of foreseeable, but it's really sickening when you think about what they did. These people thrown into these icy waters, and as some of them, as cold as they must have been and sickly and whatever, climbing out on shore. Picture mothers with their children dragging them to shore, thinking they might have, reached safety, and then to be hacked to pieces right there on shore. Just imagine that scene. Again, the public spectacle. It reminds me of the imagery from France during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, or the attacks on the Dutch cities like Antwerp during the Spanish Fury. We covered those incidents in the first couple of episodes of the podcast. But don't worry, in the long run, there would be a vicious response from England. But in the short term, this only fueled the English fears of Catholicism. It may have felt good in the revolting Irish, but this was really short-sighted. They had it reasonably good, stable at least. You just think when clearer heads prevailed, they must have realized there would be retaliation. I will say I know, or at least I feel like I know or understand the level of frustration that they had reached. I can't imagine if somebody came into my homeland and started, taking over and dictating what we were going to do. Whether it's, my country or my state or my county or my town, we're the local folks. So anyways, they were pretty much an occupied country, but their victory would be short-lived, tragically. Make no mistake. I feel for the Irish as a society. I'm American, but I have an Irish heritage. So, somehow, oddly enough, you're from that region of the world. You feel like, somehow you take part in the tragedy. I really don't, but I feel for the Irish society. These were grave atrocities, though. And most occupiers aren't going to ignore grave atrocities. So there's more to this, but let's get back to England. Even with all the differences between Charles and Parliament, neither side approved of the rebellion in Ireland. Both sides felt something had to be done. There had to be a response, an official response. Charles returned to London in late November, just as the Irish crisis was heating up and the reports were coming in. The question was not if they would act, but who would control the English army. Here's the thought process from both sides. The king's thought process was if Parliament controlled the army, that would be an insult, first of all. The king was the rightful leader of the army. He always had been. But if Parliament controlled the army, what would they do with it after Ireland? So they've decided to fund a national army, and then they take care of the problem in Ireland. They're already trying to legally, politically take care of the problem with the king and his court. Charles was wondering what they would do with an army once it was assembled after Ireland. Would they use it to depose him? Conversely, then, from Parliament's point of view, they had pushed the envelope quite far. If Charles controlled the army, what would he do with it after Ireland? They were in the process of dismantling his court, right? Well, Parliament responded with a document called the Grand Remonstrance. Because remember, he has no funds. Charles has no funds unless Parliament authorizes them. Not enough to fund a national army. So the Grand Remonstrance was a record of the grievances that Parliament had against Charles. Now, don't think of this as just a few paragraphs. Think of this like a large volume book. They listed 204 grievances. And this Grand Remonstrance was instigated by none other than John Pym. It called for the expulsion of the bishops from the House of Lords, the review of official appointments, and veto power for Parliament. So you want this or that person on your Privy Council or to be one of your advisors, your close advisors. We'll tell you if we accept that or not. It did away with the land sales confiscated by Irish rebels. The overall tone was anti-Catholic. It was anti-Laudian. It was not specifically anti-Charles. So in addition to the political reform, they wanted ecclesiastical reform. They called for a general synod from England and abroad of like-minded scholars to set church government and oversight. So it was a political and a religious rebuke. And isn't it interesting that they don't want a foreign army in their country, but as long as the ecclesiastical brain trust that they assemble agrees with them, they're more than willing to take internationals. So anyways, on November 22nd, it narrowly passed 159 to 148. Remember, they had absolutely clobbered it, 204 to 59 or whatever when it came to Strafford. But this Grand Remonstrance divided Parliament. Because of its breadth, some moderate men that had been in the parliamentarian camp moved to the royalist camp. I mean, when it gets down to it, a lot of people will back down rather than actually bring down a government. We see this in U.S. politics, right? I mean, we fight tooth and nail, but most contested elections or campaigns are eventually, sooner rather than later, conceded by one candidate or another. I mean, and they'll say something in this, contested election in their concession speech. They'll say something like, for the good of the institution or the government, for the security of the republic or for the security of our democracy or whatever. But eventually someone will concede. They'll recognize it's a no-win situation. And even though they might have legal ground to stand on or more options to work through, they concede. Because what they don't want to see is the fall of the government. They don't want to bring that kind of contention, right? But the reality is that when these more moderate guys switched camps, it didn't actually break the stalemate. It only further radicalized the opposition to the king. It purified the ranks. It made the opposition smaller, possibly, but they were more tightly aligned to the end game now. You clearly understood where the lines were drawn after this. So Charles received the remonstrance on December 1st, 1641. And in typical Charles fashion, he dragged his feet. So Parliament did something almost unthinkable at that point. They published the document before Charles had a chance to respond. That's bold and embarrassing. We might do that in politics today. We play the gotcha card. We play the I'm going to frame the argument before you can card in the public arena. That wasn't done back then. That was an embarrassment. So Charles did respond on December 23rd. He would not remove his bishops. He defended his advisors, and he would hold off on any decisions on Irish land sales until after the hostilities had ended. Now, he did renounce Roman Catholicism, but not the Church of England's governance. Charles had tried to be mild in his response, much like Parliament's been trying to be mild in, their agitation, because this was an effort to win back more of the moderates, if there were any left to win back. But frankly, the whole business had gone too far at this point, and there was nothing left but the great showdown between Charles and John Pym. And it got very ugly very quickly. But that's a story for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really made the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.